In the dim chamber where sterile light trembled against ancient stone, a hush settled over the machines that marked the narrowing of a life lived beneath the weight of crowns. No mortal hand forged. Rome held its breath as the year 2025 pressed upon the windows of the Gemelli ward, and the air carried the heaviness of something unseen, moving just beyond the veil. Those who stood closest to the bed sensed it first not as sound but as a shift in the atmosphere, a quiet stirring like the first tremor before a deep awakening. The old shepherd lay still, his chest rising with the effort of a weary pilgrim nearing the final gate. Yet within his fading strength a fire glowed subtle but resolute, as though some truth, long held in silence, sought a path into the world before the last thread of breath escaped him. Two figures kept vigil, not the witnesses chosen by circumstance alone. A young priest, newly ordained, stood rooted at the foot of the bed, unsure if he watched a passing or the birth of something more unsettling. At his side, a nurse moved with gentle precision, accustomed to the frailty of bodies, but unprepared for the weight of soul. They did not speak. The silence itself seemed charged, as if the walls of the room leaned in to listen. Outside the window, Rome continued in restless motion, unaware that within this small chamber a word waited that could tilt the world upon its axis. In the distance, the bells of an unseen church, tolling the hour, bled faintly through the night air, each strike folding into the next with the rhythm of an ancient prophecy. The Pope opened his eyes, not in confusion, but with an awareness that belonged to one who had walked far beyond the boundaries of earthly concern. His gaze drifted past the ceiling, past the thin glow of the machines, toward some horizon only he could see. Breath gathered with difficulty, yet there was intention in it, a gathering of strength, not for life, but for revelation. His lips shaped a message before sound emerged, as if the meaning preceded the words themselves. What passed from him was not loud, not forceful, but carried the solemn weight of a final testimony. He spoke of Jesus not as the world had been taught to remember him, but as one whose presence shattered the divisions men had built to contain the holy. He whispered of a face long obscured by centuries of fear and grandeur, a face that bore neither the armor of kings nor the distance of untouchable divinity. It was the face of one who stepped into the margins where forgotten souls lingered and lifted them with a tenderness that defied empires. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to widen as though unseen doors had opened onto a larger world. The young priest felt his breath halt. The nurse felt a chill move through her as if the air itself listened. Something spoken within that dim sanctuary pushed against the boundaries of the established order a truth so raw it trembled like a candle in a storm. And when the whisper faded, the room fell into a profound stillness. Neither witness knew if they had heard the confession of a dying man or the echo of a deeper voice speaking through human frailty. Yet each sensed that the words now existed in the world like an ember that could ignite 1,000 destinies. Rome still slept. But the two who stood in that quiet threshold understood that the night would not stay silent for long. The revelation carried from those faint lips was a seed cast into history, and from it would rise questions capable of dividing kingdoms, healing wounds, or reshaping the very image of Christ held in the hearts of millions. The bells tolled again far off in the city, the sound drifting like a summons, and the vigil continued as the world unknowingly turned toward a dawn unlike any before. Long before the sterile glow of that Roman hospital before the machines and whispered prayers, there was a boy in Buenos Aires who walked streets that smelled of dust exhaust and the faint sweetness of bakery bread at dawn. His name was George, and he moved through the city as one who watched more than he spoke. Noticing the tired faces at bus stops, the children chasing stray dogs, the men bent over carts of fruit, he saw a world already divided into those who were seen and those who were passed by as if invisible. In the small parish where he first lingered near the back pews, the figure of Jesus above the altar looked distant, wrapped in gold, suspended far above the worn wooden benches. Yet outside in the markets and alleyways, George glimpsed another presence, quieter and closer, in the simple kindness of a shared meal in a hand laid gently on a shoulder. It was as if two images of Jesus ran side by side through his young mind, one clothed in grandeur, the other hidden among the poor, and he sensed a tension there that would follow him for the rest of his days. When he entered the society of Jesus, he did so rushing toward power, but as someone seeking a name for the restlessness inside. The vows, the studies, the long hours of silence, all of it formed a narrow path that pressed him inward toward questions that had no easy answer. He read theology and philosophy, learned the language of councils and doctrines, yet each time he stepped out into the streets of Argentina and met the eyes of those who lived with empty pockets and tired souls, another kind of text opened before him. He began to suspect that the truest commentary on Christ might not be found only in books, but in how the crucified one continued to take flesh in those who suffered without applause or voice. As he rose through the ranks, from teacher to rector, from bishop to cardinal, the church wrapped him in vestments and titles. Yet something of the old boy from Buenos Aires refused to vanish. In meetings heavy with procedure, his thoughts would drift back to the small chapel where a single candle flickered before a worn crucifix, and to the day when, as a young priest, he had watched an old woman light that candle with trembling hands and whisper a name only God and grief understood. In that simple act he had sensed a Christ who was not far off, not armoured in untouchable glory, but leaning close enough to receive tears and the smell of laundry soap still clinging to worn sleeves. Over the years, George watched how the image of Jesus was used and misused. He saw Christ painted as a stern judge guarding a narrow gate invoked to defend systems that kept the poor at the margins. He saw him reduced to an icon for private comfort, detached from the unjust structures that broke human lives. He saw him wrapped in national flags and political slogans, as if the one who died outside the city gates now endorsed every wall built in fear. And beneath all of this, an unease grew in the heart of the man who would become Francis, an unease that sounded like a question whispered in prayer. Who is Jesus when all the decorations are stripped away, when the incense fades, when the banners fall the day the conclave chose him, when the smoke turned white above St. Peter? The crowd heard a name, Francis, and saw a gesture of simplicity, a man greeting them without the usual distance of a remote monarch. What they did not see was the interior resolve taking shape like a quiet vow. If this mantle must be carried, he would carry it as someone who had walked the streets of the poor and did not intend to forget their faces. From the beginning, his papacy bore the marks of that earlier restlessness. He chose a modest residence instead of the halls of marble, visited prisons and migrant camps, laid his hands on bodies that others avoided. In homilies and letters he returned again and again to the same insistence that Jesus is found where the world prefers Not to look at the measure of fidelity is not how tightly one clings to privilege, but how far one goes to meet the forgotten. Yet even as he spoke, Francis knew that the structures of the church and the habits of many hearts still clung to an older image, one that placed Jesus safely on a throne above history, rather than in the dust where history bleeds. This tension became a wound he carried in silence. He saw that whenever Jesus was imagined only as the distant Lord of safe souls, the living Christ who identified himself with the hungry, the stranger, the prisoner was gently set aside. And so, in private prayer, he stood before the crucifix and dared to ask whether the Church, in protecting doctrine, had sometimes hidden the very face it confessed to adore. This question did not make him an enemy of tradition, but it did make him a restless guardian of its core. He read the Gospels not as a museum record, but as a fire still burning, and in that flame he saw again and again a pattern Jesus drawing near to those held unclean, Jesus confronting the powerful whose piety masked injustice, Jesus revealing God not as a distant emperor, but as a father who runs toward the lost. As the years advanced and his body grew frail, the inner urgency only sharpened. Time was finite. The window to speak clearly was narrowing. History had layered Jesus with crowns and costumes, some beautiful, some suffocating. Francis began to sense that his final task was not to invent something new, but to strip away enough varnish for the original wood to breathe again. He did not imagine himself as a reformer standing above the church, but as a servant haunted by the look in the eyes of those who had been told that Christ did not stand fully with them. In the quiet of his room, he would recall the faces of men and women turned away from communion, the exhaustion of migrants in camps, the stories of those wounded by cold religion, and he would hear in their cries an echo of the cry on the cross, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" That cry, more than decrees and councils, became for him the key to the mystery. If God had entered the deepest abandonment, then no human exile lay outside divine solidarity. And if that was true, then any image of Jesus that left some people on the outside of that embrace was not yet the full truth. This conviction did not come to him as a tidy theory, but as a slow, burning certainty. It shaped his letters on creation, where he spoke of the earth groaning like a wounded body. It guided his appeals for mercy over condemnation, his insistence that the church must be a field hospital more than a fortress. Behind each gesture stood the same hidden question that had followed him from the streets of Buenos Aires to the balconies of Rome. Will the church dare to show the world a Jesus who truly stands with the crushed? Or will it continue to veil that face behind safety and splendor? And you have you ever sensed beneath the official images another presence drawing near in the quiet shame of your own story? As this journey unfolds, hold that question close, because it is not only the church that is being asked to look again at the face of Christ. Every heart is summoned into that gaze. Thank you for staying with this story, for allowing these scenes and questions to move within you as the path descends deeper into the mystery of who Jesus truly is. In the long memory of faith, the figure of Jesus has never stood still. Across centuries, his image shifted like light passing through stained glass, each age choosing colors that reflected its fears, its longings, its wounds. To understand the force of the revelation whispered in that Roman hospital, one must descend into this gallery of shifting portraits where Christ has been shaped and reshaped by the hands of empires, councils, artists, and crowds, searching for a face that would confirm their hopes or calm their anxieties. In the earliest days, before creeds hardened into stone followers, spoke of him in trembling tones as one who walked dusty roads, touched the untouchable, and carried divine fire in the tenderness of human flesh. They did not yet crown him with gold. They remembered him breaking bread, lifting children, kneeling to wash dirty feet. His power was not distant. It was immediate presence that dissolved shame and drew the marginalized into the center of God's story. But as the centuries turned and the small gatherings in homes gave way to cathedrals built with imperial ambition, another image rose. Jesus became a cosmic ruler, enthroned above the earth. His wounds preserved, but transformed into symbols of dominance rather than shared suffering. The world of empires wanted a Christ who resembled a sovereign, and so he was painted with broad shoulders, stern eyes, garments embroidered with authority. The gentle rabbi who wept over a city became in many imaginations a judge who watched from a distance, balancing sins on scales. In medieval Europe, his portrayal grew heavier still. Artists carved him into vast altarpieces surrounded by angels who waited like soldiers at command. The suffering Christ of Good Friday was displayed with exquisite anguish, but this suffering often served to remind the faithful of their guilt rather than to draw them into solidarity with the oppressed. From lofty pulpits he was invoked to defend order, hierarchy, and the sharp borders that separated clergy from commoner. Yet in hidden corners of the same age, another Christ lingered, carried quietly by the poor. This was the Jesus who walked beside peasants enduring famine, who heard prayers whispered over dying children, who felt nearer to the displaced than to the kings who minted coins with his cross. These humble believers held on to a different vision, a Christ who bent low rather than ruled high, a companion more than a conqueror. The Renaissance breathed new life into his humanity. Painters began to show the soft crease around his eyes, the shadows of weariness, the warmth of an embrace. His divinity was still honored, but his closeness became visible again. He appeared in gardens, on roadsides, in humble homes, as one who could share bread with ordinary people. But even this beauty held tension, for the courts that commissioned these works prized elegance more than the raw truth of his poverty. They wanted a Christ refined enough to hang in palaces. The Reformation cracked open the altar rails with violent force. Reformers insisted that no earthly institution could own his image. They stripped churches of ornamentation, fearful that art had disguised him behind human invention. In doing so, they freed him from the grandeur that had accumulated like dust, yet they sometimes pushed him so far into abstraction that his touch, his laughter, his anger at injustice faded into ideas rather than encounters. In the centuries that followed, the world fractured into new stories, and each culture sculpted Christ according to its own wounds and dreams. In Africa, he was the liberator who stood against oppressors, the healer who walked through villages scarred by colonial chains. In Latin America, he became the companion of workers, the voice rising from barrios where the poor prayed for justice. In Asia, he was the wise teacher who spoke into ancient traditions, the compassionate guide who walked through suffering with serene defiance. In indigenous communities across continents, he was woven into stories of land ancestors and the sacred rhythms of creation, no longer foreign but intimately present. Yet through all these portrayals, another face remained overshadowed, one rarely allowed to rise fully into the light. It was the face of Jesus as he moved through the Gospels, unsettling the powerful, lifting the humiliated, crossing every line drawn to separate the pure from the stained. This Christ did not prefer temples over streets. He did not defend systems that crushed the weak. He did not bless the comfort of those who ignored the suffering at their door. He walked straight into the places respectable religion avoided. He touched those whom purity laws condemned. He spoke with women whose stories had been erased. He welcomed sinners whom society buried beneath shame. And he did all of this not as an optional kindness, but as a very revelation of God's heart. This was the face that demanded attention, the face that carried a fire capable of burning down the illusions we build to protect our power or soothe our fears. But history often turned its gaze elsewhere, because this Jesus could not be used to justify cruelty, wrapped in doctrine or indifference, blessed by ritual. Over time, the more challenging contours of his life dimmed behind layers of comfort and caution. Many came to know a Christ who asked for quiet obedience but not courageous compassion, a Christ who guarded institutions but did not disrupt injustice, a Christ who promised heaven but did not unsettle the hells humans create on earth. It was into this long tension that the Pope walked as both witness and wounded seeker. He knew these portraits. He had prayed before them. He had watched how each served or distorted the truth. And beneath all the layers, he sensed a missing thread, a truth that once unveiled would cause the ground beneath centuries of assumptions to tremble. In the dim hospital room where revelation passed through fading breath, the whisper had not introduced a new doctrine. It had pointed to the face long hidden behind the others, a face that once seen could not be forgotten, a face that asked humanity to choose between the comfort of distance and the cost of compassion. And now this question rises for you as well. When you think of Jesus, which face has shaped your faith? Which one has shaped your fears? And what might awaken in you if the hidden face came into full light? Night settled over the papal residence like a shroud of ancient memory, carrying with it a stillness so deep it seemed to mute even the distant hum of Rome. In that stillness, the boundary between waking and dreaming loosened, and the frail shepherd, drifting into restless sleep, felt himself drawn into a realm where time no longer marched in straight lines. Shadows lengthened into corridors, corridors into cloisters, and cloisters into vast halls, where the air trembled with voices long gone, yet strangely present. It was here in this threshold between breath and eternity that a figure emerged from the dimness, neither startling nor gentle, simply inevitable. The visitor did not announce himself yet. Francis recognized the aura of one who had walked the same path centuries before. The robes were humble, the posture steady, the gaze carrying a depth that belonged to a soul, forged in both reverence and struggle. This was a guide, a companion from the luminous company of those who had wrestled with truth until their hearts bore the marks of divine fire. The figure gestured without words, and the Pope felt the floor beneath him shift into a terrain woven of memory and revelation. In an instant, they stood before the early centuries of the Church, when a scattered handful of fishermen, widows, slaves, and seekers carried the message of Jesus not in libraries or councils, but in their wounds and hopes. Francis watched as simple believers gathered in cramped rooms, breaking bread with trembling hands, speaking of a teacher who had lifted their shame and turned their grief into courage. These were not people clinging to power, but souls fighting to keep love alive in a world ruled by spears and empires. Yet even as he watched, another scene unfolded alongside it. Grand halls rose from stone councils, gathered beneath the shadow of imperial favour, and debates grew heated as bishops forged creeds to defend truth against confusion. The guide let Francis see both the courage and the cost. Doctrine became a shield against chaos, but sometimes it hardened into a wall that kept out the very ones Jesus had welcomed. The vision shifted again. They now walked through a medieval sanctuary where incense thickened the air and golden icons glittered like captive stars. Monks laboured over illuminated manuscripts, crafting beauty to honour the divine. Yet there was a weight here too. In the dim corners of the vast cathedral, Francis sensed the presence of the poor who entered quietly, unsure if the Christ who dwelled amid such glory still knew the hunger in their stomachs or the grief in their chests. The guide touched his arm, and the scene dissolved into the roar of the Renaissance, where artists carved the humanity of Christ into marble and painted his tenderness onto frescoed wall. Yet behind these masterpieces there lingered an unease that Francis felt like a faint tremor. Patronage demanded elegance more than honesty, and the Christ portrayed was often shaped by the expectations of the wealthy rather than the raw compassion of the Gospels. The guide led him onward into the storm of the Reformation. The sound of shattered icons echoed like thunder. Walls once covered in sacred art stood bare, stripped in a desperate attempt to rescue Christ from centuries of ornamentation. Francis saw the liberation in this, but also the loss. The living presence of Christ, once tender and close, risked dissolving into abstraction as disputes hardened into division. Each age carried its truth and its blind spots, its devotion and its fear. The guide allowed him to witness it all, not as condemnation, but as a long unfolding of human longing mixed with human frailty. Then the visions darkened, and Francis stood before the modern age. The world trembled under the weight of wars, ideologies, global upheavals. Amid the rubble of fallen cities, he saw believers clutching small crosses in trenches, mothers praying over starving children, refugees carrying fragments of hope across desert and sea. In these faces he recognized the Christ he had long sought, the one not enthroned above suffering, but immersed within it. The guide stepped forward and brought Francis to a final scene, one that struck him with unexpected force. It was a great hall in the Vatican centuries earlier, where councils and committees discussed how best to preserve the unity of the Church. Francis watched scholars debate the purity of doctrine, the boundaries of orthodoxy, the structure of authority. Their intentions were earnest, yet he sensed something trembling beneath the surface. In the desire to guard truth, they had sometimes buried the very face that truth revealed. A face that refused to stay confined within systems built for safety. A face that shone most clearly not in palaces, but in prisons and alleys and fields where the forgotten laboured unseen. The guide finally spoke, not with sound, but with a resonance that moved through the marrow of the soul. The Church has walked through centuries of glory and shadow trying to hold the light. But the light is not contained by walls or titles. It walks where human hands rarely reach. And the Christ you seek, the Christ who compels your breath, even now calls the Church to remember what was lost beneath layers of caution and pride. Francis felt these words settle upon him like a mantle, weighty yet clarifying. His life had been a long search for the face of Jesus, yet he had not understood until this moment that history itself had become a veil obscuring that face. The guide placed a hand upon his shoulder. What you whispered, because the time has come for unveiling. This is not rebellion, but return. Not destruction, but remembrance. Not innovation, but restoration of the Christ who bends toward the least. The vision dimmed, the halls dissolved, and the Pope awoke once more in his narrow hospital bed. The machines hummed. The nurse watched. The young priest wiped his eyes without knowing why. Something had passed between worlds and now lingered in the frail breaths of the man who carried Rome upon his shoulders. The guide was gone, but the charge remained. And the world, unaware, edged closer to the moment when this unveiled truth would confront every heart that dared to look. On the morning of the homily, the sky over Rome carried a muted glow, the kind that settles over a city before something long hidden edges toward revelation. Pilgrims filled the vast square beneath the towering colonnades, their breath rising in small clouds as they waited for words they believed would comfort, guide, or quietly reaffirm the world they already knew. None sensed that beneath the marble, behind the embroidered vestments, an unseen tension coiled like a tremor, waiting to break through stone. Inside the basilica, the air was thick with incense, drifting in slow spirals toward the dome where saints and prophets gazed down with painted solemnity. The choir, as voices rose and fell like distant waves, carrying the familiar cadence of ancient worship. Yet beneath the beauty, a subtle unease pressed against the walls, for the man who stood ready to speak was not merely preparing another pastoral reflection. His heart carried a weight shaped by decades of wrestling with the hidden face of Christ, and the urgency to reveal what he had glimpsed had grown fierce. When he stepped forward, the murmuring ceased. Francis stood beneath the towering canopy of bronze, his frail frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the space. Yet the silence that fell over the congregation wrapped around him like a mantle. His voice began softly, not with authority, but with a tone that felt like an invitation into something deeper than ritual. He spoke of Jesus not as the distant sovereign often framed in art, but as the one who moved deliberately toward those considered unworthy. He recalled moments from the Gospels where Jesus crossed lines drawn to maintain purity, where he lifted those society had crushed, where he chose table fellowship with the shamed rather than the celebrated. The congregation leaned in, unsure whether what they heard was simply a renewed emphasis on compassion or the opening of a door long kept shut. Then the shift came subtle at first, like a wind rising from a hidden valley. Francis's voice deepened, and a strange clarity settled over his words. He spoke of a truth that had followed him since his early years, a truth he had guarded in silence, for fear of the upheaval it might stir. He spoke of a Jesus whose mission had been narrowed by centuries, whose radical identification with the least had been softened, sanitized, and made safe for institutions that preferred order to upheaval. And then came the sentence. The one that would not survive the official record, the one that would be erased before the homily was released to the world. He said that the full image of Christ could no longer be contained within the structures built around him, that the purity of Jesus' compassion did not align with the boundaries the Church had drawn, and that God's presence was found first among those cast aside. He added that the Church, if it wished to be faithful, must rediscover the Christ who walks among the rejected rather than the Christ enthroned above the wounds of the world. His words echoed through the basilica like a slow-moving thunder, not loud but undeniable. For a moment, the vast space felt suspended, as if angels themselves paused mid-flight. A few faces tightened. Some lowered their eyes. A tremor of shock moved through the ranks of clergy seated nearest the altar. They recognized the implications at once. This was not a poetic flourish. This was not a harmless reflection. This was a reframing of Christ that challenged the architecture of authority, purity, and exclusion that had shaped centuries. When Francis finished the homily, he carried the quiet exhaustion of a man who had just stepped across a threshold he knew he could never return from. Applause rose, but with hesitation, a sound more uncertain than celebratory. Outside the basilica, The square buzzed with murmurs as people tried to articulate what they had heard but could not yet name. That evening, a small circle of officials gathered in a stone room beneath the palace. The recording of the homily lay before them. They listened to the controversial line once, twice, a third time. It hung in the air like a spark that could leap into flame. The decision came quickly. The sentence would be removed. The public transcript would present a softer version, a harmless version, an echo without its thunder. The edited text was released before dawn. Yet the truth had not been fully contained. Among the congregation that day were several who had recorded the homily on personal devices as pilgrims often do. Their recordings captured the unedited moment, and though most of those recordings would remain unseen, one found its way into digital currents that moved faster than official censors could reach. A short clip surfaced anonymously, a grainy video with Francis's voice trembling through the speakers. The world heard the line that had been cut. Reactions erupted like a storm breaking open after long pressure. Some hailed it as the most honest summoning to discipleship in generations, a return to the raw gospel. Others saw it as a fracture in the very bones of the church, a destabilizing departure from doctrinal safety. Commentators argued late into the night. Bishops whispered behind closed doors. Theologians parsed every syllable. And far from Rome, in kitchens and living rooms, ordinary believers replayed the line and felt something shift inside them. But within the Vatican, a deeper ripple moved quietly, known only to a few. For the Pope's sentence, the one erased from the official record, was more than critique. It was a signal that the veil covering the hidden face of Christ was beginning to lift, and nothing built on the old assumptions would remain untouched. As for Francis, he returned to his room carrying a solemn calm. He knew the words could not be retrieved. And in the dim light of his private chapel, he closed his eyes, sensing that the revelation he had released into the world would soon demand a reckoning far beyond the marble walls of Rome. The storm did not break all at once. It began as a whisper inside the echoing chambers of Rome, a subtle tightening of voices behind carved doors, a quiet tensing in corridors where the walls themselves seemed trained to keep secret. Yet within hours the whisper grew, gathering force as circles of influence reacted with alarm or awe to the words the Pope had dared to speak beneath the bronze canopy of St. Peter's. The first ripples moved through the clergy closest to the centre of power, men who had built their lives around certainties polished over decades. They felt the tremor like a crack in an old foundation. For some it awakened dread. For others a long-buried longing. In conference rooms, lit by narrow windows, senior officials spoke in hushed tones, weighing the risks as if handling a fragile relic. They did not question the Pope's sincerity. They questioned the magnitude of what he had set in motion. The idea that Jesus might be found more faithfully among the rejected than among the adorned halls of hierarchy was unsettling, for it reshaped not doctrine alone, but the very instinct of how the Church had come to understand itself. One cardinal, aged and weary, pressed trembling fingers against his brow. He had given his entire life to a vision of order, one where Jesus blessed structures that guarded tradition. To him, the Pope's words felt like a stone, dropped into a deep well, sending out circles that could not be recalled. Yet in the same room, a younger bishop leaned forward, as though hearing a long-denied truth rising at last to the surface. He had served in refugee camps, walked among communities rejected by both state and sanctuary, and had often wondered why the Jesus he met in those broken places seemed more alive than the one defined in polished document. To him, the Pope's words were not a threat, but a mirror showing what had been hidden yet present in the gospel all along. The storm reached the priests, scattered across continents. Some felt the ground shift beneath them when they heard the unedited line from the leaked recording. They had been trained to guard boundaries, to preserve clarity, to guide their flock with steady hands. But now the question emerged, like a tide rising against the shore. Would they cling to the safety of well-worn interpretations, or allow themselves to follow the Christ who walked into the instability of human suffering with unprotected compassion? Many did not sleep that night. In parishes across Europe and North America, priests stared at the small red sanctuary lamp trembling beside the tabernacle and felt torn between loyalty to tradition and a pull towards something deeper, something that looked more like the Jesus who washed feet rather than the Jesus enthroned in triumphal mosaics. In monasteries, where silence laid thick over the stones, monks gathered for the evening office with a new heaviness in their steps. The reading of the Psalms rose with its usual rhythm, but beneath the chant ran a quieter current. Some wondered if the Christ who walked the cloisters with them was calling for a new kind of fidelity, one that might cost them the comfort of habitual certainty. Others feared the loss of a stability they had vowed their lives upon. The tremor spread beyond Rome as institutions and reached the forgotten edges of the world. In a shelter on the outskirts of Manila, a nun paused in her work as the news reached her through a small radio. The children around her slept on thin mats, their breaths soft and uneven, their futures uncertain. She listened to the Pope's words and felt a warmth rise behind her ribs, something like recognition. For years she had believed that the real Christ walked these narrow streets rather than the polished corridors of power, and now the shepherd of Rome had dared to say it aloud. Her eyes filled. She whispered a prayer, not of fear, but of gratitude. Far across the ocean, a migrant mother huddled with her daughters in an overcrowded border camp. She had no theology, no formal catechism, only a worn plastic rosary she carried through every crossing. When she heard the translation of the Pope's controversial sentence on a volunteer's phone, she held her children closer. To her, it sounded like the voice of God breaking through walls that had long kept people like her unseen. But the storm also gathered its darker winds. In wealthy enclaves where Catholic identity was entangled with social status, anger rose quickly. Some believers felt betrayed, fearing that the Pope's vision stripped their faith of the dignity they believed it had earned. At dinner tables in suburban homes, voices sharpened. In online forums, accusations flew. Words like heresy and danger hissed across screens with a venom born of fear. They did not want a Jesus who walked into the margins, because the margins unsettled the security of their faith. Yet the sharpest tension unfolded within the hearts of ordinary churchgoers, people who neither sought conflict nor welcomed upheaval. They replayed the leaked audio clip in their kitchens and living rooms, hearing the Pope's voice tremble with age yet radiate conviction. Some felt confusion tighten in their chest. Others felt scales fall from their eyes. Many simply sat in quiet bewilderment, sensing that something enormous had entered their lives without their permission. In one small village parish, a man knelt alone in a pew long after Mass had ended. He was not wealthy nor powerful, simply a father who had raised his children in the faith handed down to him. He listened again to the Pope's words on his phone, and tears blurred his vision. He had spent years believing that his failures placed him beyond Christ's nearness, that holiness was reserved for those who lived without stumbling. But now he wondered if perhaps the Christ he had feared disappointing had been searching for him in the very places he felt most unworthy. Across the world, another kind of storm gathered, quieter but profound. It rose not from outrage or confusion, but from awakening. Those who had long felt exiled by religious institutions now heard in the Pope's words a doorway swinging open. Survivors of wounds inflicted in God's name felt a small tremor of hope. Disabled believers who had been overlooked sensed that Christ's gaze might finally fall fully upon them. LGBTQ Catholics whispered to one another that the compassion of Jesus might at last be honored more honestly than the boundaries that had caused them shame. And beneath all of this, both the fear and the hope, beneath the anger and the wonder, a deeper struggle unfolded. It was the struggle between two visions of Christ, one safe, one costly, one shaped for protecting power, one shaped for healing the broken. In this tension, the Church felt itself stretched, as though standing on a threshold where one step led back into familiar security, and the other into the unknown landscape of the gospel laid bare. And while Rome debated, while believers wept or rejoiced or trembled, the Pope lay in his hospital bed, unaware of the magnitude of the storm. His whispered revelation had awakened. Yet the truth he had spoken continued to move like a flame through dry fields. It asked every heart the same unyielding question: which Christ will you follow? The one shaped by fear, or the one who walks into the suffering of the world without hesitation? In the first hours after the leaked recording escaped the marble walls of Rome, the world responded not with a single voice, but with 1,000 conflicting echoes. What began as a trembling ember in one corner of the digital world grew into a blaze, crossing continents in the time it takes for a breath to rise and fall. Screens glowed in darkened living rooms, in crowded trains, in quiet university offices, where scholars bent over pages yellowed with age. And everywhere the same question pulsed beneath the noise. What had the Pope revealed about Christ that both unsettled and awakened so many at once? In academic halls the reaction was immediate and fierce. Theologians, historians, linguists, specialists in scripture, and scholars of ancient cultures gathered around tables stacked with texts that had shaped centuries of belief. Some leaned forward with excitement, sensing that the Pope's words cracked open a door long sealed by caution. They argued that the Christ revealed in the Gospels had always been more radical, more disruptive, more fiercely compassionate than the Christ shaped by institutional habit. They claimed that the Pope had simply named what the earliest followers knew, that Jesus had identified himself not with the privileged but with the excluded. Other scholars reacted with guarded alarm. They traced lines backward through councils, through creeds, through centuries of careful doctrinal formation, and wondered whether the Pope's unveiling risked loosening the architecture upon which Christian unity had long depended. They warned that if Christ were understood primarily through the lens of the marginalized, rather than through established categories of orthodoxy, the Church might fracture in ways not easily repaired. The debates were not polite exchanges. They were clashes of vision, each grounded in decades of study, each convinced they were guarding the truth. A few scholars found themselves unexpectedly torn. They could not deny that the Jesus of the earliest texts moved with startling freedom across boundaries, nor could they ignore the weight of tradition. They sat in silence, sensing that something deeper than mere argument was unfolding, something that asked them to choose not only with their minds but with their lives. In journalism rooms, the response was different, driven less by contemplation and more by urgency. Headlines erupted with phrases shaped to capture attention. Seismic shift in Vatican teaching. Pope challenges centuries-old hierarchy. Hidden Christ unveiled. Some outlets portrayed the moment as a crisis threatening to split the global church. Others painted Francis as a visionary finally bringing Christianity into alignment. with the cries of the oppressed. Yet beneath the sensationalism, a few journalists felt something quieter, something like reverence. They watched the leaked clip again and again, not merely listening to the words, but studying the tremble in the Pope's voice. It was not the tremble of uncertainty. It was the tremble of one who knows that truth once spoken cannot be returned to silence. In the world of politics, the reactions grew even more complex. Some leaders welcomed the Pope's words, sensing that a Christ aligned with the marginalized provided moral fuel for policies aimed at justice. Others recoiled, fearing that a church shaped by solidarity with the excluded would challenge the structures that upheld their power. Behind closed doors, advisors met in urgent conferences, asking what this shift might mean for diplomatic relations, for national debates on migration, for the fragile balance between religious identity and political opportunity. Meanwhile, another world, one often ignored by institutions, erupted with a force no authority could control. Social media pulsed like a living organism tasting electricity. Hashtags spread across languages, merging into a global conversation where theologians, skeptics, believers, wounded souls activists and wanderers all found themselves drawn into the same firelit circle. Videos of the leaked sentence were shared with captions ranging from outrage to awe. Some declared that the Pope had betrayed the faith. Others whispered that he had finally articulated the Christ they had always known in their suffering. Some simply typed a single question: who is Jesus now? In forums dedicated to scripture study, long threads unfolded as ordinary believers passed every word of the homily, some with trembling hope, others with rising fear. A few admitted that for the first time in years they felt drawn back toward faith, not because the Pope softened truth, but because he made space for them within it. In survivor communities, the response took on an even more painful depth. Those wounded by religious rejection gathered in online circles to discuss what this revelation could mean. Many had been told for years that Christ stood far from them, that they were too broken, too different, too impure to stand beneath the warmth of divine mercy. Now the words of the Pope cracked open something long sealed. If Christ truly walked first toward the excluded, then perhaps they had never been outside his embrace at all. They cried not from sentiment, but from the weight of spiritual exile beginning to lift. Yet the opposition formed quickly, and it was fierce. Influential commentators denounced the Pope with sharp certainty. Some declared his revelation irresponsible. Others feared it would undermine doctrine. A few went further, framing it as a betrayal of divine order. Their voices grew loud, amplified by those who clung to the Christ who guards boundaries rather than breaks them. This resistance was not born of malice alone. Some were driven by genuine fear. They worried that if Jesus stood without hesitation among the marginalized, the Church would be compelled to step into places it had long avoided, places where comfort dissolved and responsibility sharpened. They feared losing the security they had built upon an image of Christ shaped around stability rather than disruption. Yet, beneath the clash of arguments, a deeper movement stirred among people who had not spoken publicly at all. In small prayer groups, in dim chapels, in kitchen corners where candles flickered beside worn Bibles, believers fell into quiet reflection. They searched their memories for the first time they had encountered Jesus.
The Jesus of doctrines, but the Jesus of wounds and wonder.
Many found that their earliest glimpses of him had not come through triumph, but through moments when they were most fragile. Those memories rose like embers catching wind. They realized that the Christ who found them in their weakness had always been the Christ of the margins. Not one person, not one group, but countless hearts awakened. And through all of this, something extraordinary became clear. The debate was no longer confined to theology or politics or institution. It had become a struggle over spiritual vision, a question reaching into the most intimate corners of human longing. Who is Christ when every assumption is stripped away? And which image of him will shape the future of faith? The revelation spoken in a frail voice from a hospital bed had become a mirror held before the world. Every person, whether scholar or skeptic, devout or wounded, now faced the same reflection. What do you see when Jesus stands among the forgotten rather than above them? And what will you do with that vision? Night deepened over Rome as if the sky itself were holding its breath, waiting for history to shift beneath its own weight. What had begun as a single whispered revelation now pressed against the centuries, like a tide rising against an ancient shore. To understand the magnitude of what was unfolding, the world had to look backward, not in nostalgia, but in sober remembrance, for the Church had walked this trembling edge before. And each time it did, the ground shook, the walls cracked, and something old either broke or was reborn. In the vision granted to Francis in those final days, history did not stretch in a neat line. It spiraled, rose, collapsed, and rose again like a great bridge suspended over the abyss. Every reform, every conflict, every council, every fracture was another stone placed upon that bridge. Yet each stone carried its own fissures, hairline fractures that expanded under the pressure of truth. And now the Pope's revelation threatened to widen a fault long ignored. The first tremor Francis sensed came from the memory of a council held 6 decades earlier. Vatican II, a gathering that dared to open windows, long sealed, letting fresh air sweep through doctrines and rituals like wind through a cloister garden. It had called the faithful to engage the modern world, not with suspicion, but with hope. It changed the liturgy, the language of prayer, the understanding of other faiths. Some welcomed it as liberation, others feared it as dilution, but its impact was irreversible, and the Church staggered forward into a new age, simultaneously renewed and wounded by the very openness it embraced. Yet the fault line beneath Vatican II had never fully healed. Many still longed for the certainty of the past. Others yearned for the freedom of the future. The world had changed faster than the Church could follow, and the bridge trembled once more. Francis saw this tension as clearly as if it were carved into the air. But the vision went deeper still, pulling him toward a far older fracture. The Reformation, a time when the Church splintered under the weight of corruption, fear, and the cry of conscience. What began as a plea for reform blazed into a schism that tore apart nations. Christ was claimed by opposing camps, each convinced they guarded the true flame. Blood stained the soil of Europe. Trust crumbled, and the body of Christ, once whole, found itself divided by walls that no one could imagine crossing. Yet out of that devastation emerged a church forced to look at itself with new honesty, compelled to confront its abuses, to reform its institutions, to purify its mission. It survived, but the scar remained. A reminder that when truth bursts through human systems, it does not ask permission. It demands transformation. The vision darkened the air, growing dense as another turning point emerged. The Copernican Revolution, a moment when the cosmos itself rebelled against religious certainty. Humanity discovered the earth was not the center of creation. The Church resisted at first, fearing chaos. But truth could not be chained. And slowly, painfully, the Church learned that faith survived not by denying reality, but by expanding its understanding of God's grandeur. In time, the crisis became a gift, a doorway into humility. The bridge trembled but did not fall. Now a new tremor rose beneath the feet of the present age. The Pope's whispered revelation about Christ was not merely a theological nuance. It was a threat to the very architecture of comfort that institutions had built around him for centuries. If Christ stood first with the excluded, then the Church must walk there as well. If Christ resisted systems that oppressed the weak, then the Church must confront the systems that sheltered its own power. If Christ's compassion broke boundaries, then the boundaries cherished for centuries could no longer remain untouched. This was not a small adjustment. It was an earthquake waiting beneath the foundations. And in the vision, Francis beheld two possible futures rising like twin cities on opposite horizons. In the first city, the Church clung desperately to the old image of Christ enthroned above suffering. It fortified its doctrines, tightened its borders, preserved its rituals with fierce loyalty. But its walls grew high, its gates narrow, its people fewer. Those outside looked upon it with confusion, sorrow, or indifference. A cold beauty radiated from this city, but it lacked breath. In the second city, the Church stepped trembling, but resolute into the world's wound. It opened its gates wide. It walked into refugee camps, shelters, alleyways, prisons, communities marked by shame and sorrow. It did not carry itself as a triumphant institution, but as a companion to the broken. In this city, Christ's compassion shaped not only belief but behavior. The Church lost some of its grandeur, some of its certainty, some of its control, but it gained something older, something forgotten, something fierce and luminous. It gained the living pulse of the gospel. The guide from the earlier vision returned for a brief moment, though Francis could not tell whether he stood outside or inside the dream. He spoke with a clarity that pierced through the haze. Every age of the Church faces its own unveiling. Some resist it and fracture, some embrace it and are renewed, but the truth remains the same. Christ walks where suffering is greatest. Where will the Church choose to walk? The visions dissolved, leaving Francis confronted only with the stillness of his hospital room. But the question remained like a burning coal. The world now stood at another precipice, another fault line, and the revelation he had spoken, fragile yet fierce, had already begun to widen the ground beneath every believer. The path ahead was uncertain, but one truth shone like a flame in the darkness. Whenever the Church dared to step into the unknown, for the sake of compassion, resurrection followed. Dawn rose over a divided world, as though the sun itself were uncertain where to cast its first light, for the Church now stood between two futures that pulled at its soul like opposing tides. The revelation spoken in a frail whisper had become a mirror held to every conscience, and in that reflection two paths emerged, each illuminated by a different vision of Christ. One path led back toward the familiar. It promised stability, order, and the comfort of a faith untouched by the complexity of human suffering. The other path stretched into the unknown, into places where Christ moved with unguarded tenderness among those the world ignored. And the heart of the Church, like a pilgrim at a crossroads, trembled between the two. Across cathedrals and chapels, the division took silent shape. In some sanctuaries, believers knelt before polished altars, praying that the Pope's revelation would fade like a passing storm. They feared the cost of change, feared losing the security that had held their families for generations. Their faith was sincere, but it clung to an image of Christ high above history, untouched by the dust and wounds of the world. In these places, the old vision remained bright, a Christ robed in majesty rather than mystery, a Christ who blessed obedience more readily than compassion. But elsewhere, another heartbeat stirred. In parishes humbled by poverty, in communities wounded by exclusion, in congregations where the faithful gathered with more hope than certainty, the Pope's words fell like rain on thirsty soil. Here the revelation was not threat, but promise, a reminder that Christ walked first among the forgotten. These believers were weary of a church that spoke of mercy yet kept its distance from the suffering that cried out at its gates. For them, the Pope's whisper sounded like a return, a reopening of a path that had always belonged to the gospel. Two visions, two futures, two churches growing from one root. And yet beneath the tension, something deeper unfolded, something quieter than debate and more enduring than fear. It rose in the stories of ordinary souls whose lives bore the imprint of grace in ways arguments could never fully capture. A young widow in Brazil who had felt exiled from her parish after her husband's death listened to the leaked line and sensed the presence of Christ drawing near again. An elderly man in Ireland who had carried guilt for decades whispered through tears that he no longer believed Jesus stood far above him. A teenager in Chicago, long wounded by rejection, replayed the Pope's trembling words and felt something like belonging for the first time in years. Their encounters did not appear in headlines, but they were the ground on which the future church would rise or fall. Meanwhile, Rome wrestled with a question older than its own walls. Should the church risk losing power for the sake of regaining the heart of Christ? The guardians of tradition feared that stepping toward the margins would erode the clarity of doctrine, weaken structure, and open doors to chaos. But the guardians of compassion feared the opposite. They feared that refusing to step toward the margins would extinguish the flame that made the church a living witness rather than a monument of stone. The choice between preservation and transformation tightened like a knot. To many it seemed impossible, but in the hidden corners of monasteries and mission houses, a different realization dawned. The church did not need to choose between truth and mercy. It needed to rediscover that the two had never been separate, for the Christ who proclaimed truth did so with a voice that healed the broken, and the Christ who embraced the wounded did so with a love that revealed the heart of God. Still, the tension deepened, widening the contrast between the two futures like clefts in a mountain rising under seismic strain. In the more fearful vision, the church retreated into its fortresses. It doubled its defences, tightened the circle of purity, and preserved its beauty with the cold precision of a museum. The rituals remained exquisite. The doctrines remained intact. But the warmth that had once drawn sinners and wanderers faded. The church became a monument, admired yet lifeless. In the more hopeful vision, the church stepped forward carrying little but the gospel and the courage to follow it into the world as wounds. It stood beside refugees, listened to survivors, embraced those long exiled from faith, and found Christ already waiting there. It did not abandon doctrine, but breathed life into it by living its deepest truth. This church looked less like an empire and more like a community of shepherds. It lost some of its grandeur, but it gained a new transparency, a new humility, a new radiance. And though it suffered criticism, suspicion, and the loss of comfort, its witness shone like a lantern in the transforming dark. Which future would rise? Neither prophecy nor authority could determine it. Only the hearts of believers could. And so the world watched as the church stretched between fear and courage, preservation and compassion, stone and flesh. Yet in the midst of this uncertainty, a final scene unfolded, subtle but powerful. A group of young Catholics from different nations and stories gathered in a quiet room lit by a single candle. They had no titles, no influence, no authority, but they prayed with sincerity. They asked to see the face of Christ, clearly not as the world shaped it, but as the gospel revealed it. And as they prayed, the candle flame flickered, as though stirred by an unseen breath. For in every age, renewal has begun not in palaces, but in small rooms where ordinary souls dare to ask for more than certainty. They ask for truth wrapped in compassion, justice wrapped in mercy, courage wrapped in humility. And the Christ who always walked among the least stirred once more in the hidden corners of the world. The dividing lines had not vanished, but hope, fragile yet fierce, had begun to take root. For even as the church trembled between two futures, the Christ of the margins walked among his people, quietly, patiently, unfailingly, waiting to see which vision they would choose. Night settled over Rome with the gravity of a world holding its breath, as though creation itself paused to witness what would follow the storm that had shaken the church from its foundation. In the narrow hospital room, the machines hummed with soft persistence, each pulse marking the fragile boundary between remaining and departing. Outside the city, as ancient stones glowed beneath street lamps, unaware that the quietest men in Rome had already altered the course of faith for generations yet unborn. When Pope Francis slipped from this world, it happened not with thunder, but with a gentleness that felt almost liturgical. The nurse who had stood beside him through the long vigil bowed her head the moment his breathing ceased, not out of ritual, but out of reverence for a life spent carrying the burdens of countless souls. The young priest placed a trembling hand over the lifeless fingers of the frail shepherd, sensing that he was touching both an ending and a beginning. Rome learned of his death before dawn, and the news rolled across the world like a muted bell. Some wept. Some fell silent. Some steeled themselves for the conflicts they feared would follow. But in the first moments after the announcement, before the debates and divisions reignited, an unusual calm descended. It was the calm of a world standing at the threshold of mourning, not yet ready to speak, not yet ready to argue, simply standing in the dim light of what had been lost. As morning spread across continents, churches opened their doors and candles multiplied like small stars against the shadows. Many who entered did so not to recite familiar prayers, but to sit in the quiet, searching themselves for the meaning of the man's final days. The homily he had given, the sentence that had been erased, the whisper he had breathed on his deathbed, all now gathered like embers smouldering in the collective memory of the faithful. And it was in this collective silence that the deeper transformation began. For when a shepherd dies, the flock listens more carefully than usual. They listen to his last words, to his last choices, to the direction in which his heart leaned as it crossed the threshold of eternity. And Francis had leaned toward the margins, toward the forgotten, toward the Christ, whose compassion refused the boundaries drawn by centuries of caution. In parishes across South America, believers stood before simple wooden crucifixes and felt the resonance of his message echo in their bones. In refugee camps on the Mediterranean coast, families gathered for prayer and whispered that the Christ who walked among them had now been named openly by the shepherd of Rome. In suburban chapels and city cathedrals, in convents and kitchens and windswept villages, believers replayed the line that had been cut from the official record. Each time they heard it, their hearts stirred as though something hidden within them had waited for years to be acknowledged. Some felt discomfort. Some felt liberation, but no one felt nothing. Meanwhile, within the Vatican, the air thickened with both grief and gravity. Cardinals gathered in solemn procession, their robes sweeping across marble floors as they prepared for the conclave that would choose the next successor of Peter. But beneath their formal steps lay a tension deeper than any ritual. They knew the decision before them was no ordinary task. It would determine not only the leadership of the church, but the very vision that would define Christianity as path through the century. Would they elect a guardian of the old boundaries, hoping to restore the stability shaken by Francis's revelation? Or would they choose a shepherd willing to walk the path he had opened, the path leading into the wounds of the world, where Christ's compassion burned brightest? No conclave in recent memory had carried such weight, for this choice was not merely organizational. It was spiritual. It was existential. It was the choice between two images of Christ, two futures, for the church, two ways of standing in the world. As Rome prepared for the decision, another movement stirred far from its walls, unnoticed by the powerful but unmistakably real. It awakened in hearts that carried no titles, no authority, no influence beyond their neighborhoods. It awakened in believers whose faith had grown weary under the weight of exclusion or silence. It awakened in the young who longed for a church brave enough to walk where Christ walked. It awakened in the elderly who had prayed for decades that compassion would triumph over fear. In these souls, something began to crystallize, something like a vow. They would no longer wait for institutions alone to reveal Christ. They would reveal him in their own lives, in their own choices, in their own neighborhoods. They would meet the poor with tenderness, not pity. They would welcome the excluded without hesitation. They would forgive as though forgiveness itself were a sacrament. They would carry compassion into the world not as obligation but as worship. And slowly, quietly, a new church began to rise.
A church defined by decrees, but a church defined by witness.
A church that understood Christ not as a distant sovereign but as the companion of the wounded. A church that saw holiness not in separation but in solidarity. This new church did not replace the old. It grew within it like light through stained glass, reframing what had always been there, yet seldom fully seen. Its power was not political, but incarnational. Its mission was not to defend Christ from the world, but to reveal him within it. And in this rising, the revelation whispered by the dying Pope found its home. The world did not change instantly. Debates continued, fears persisted, institutions shifted slowly, but transformation had begun at the level where Christ always begins his work, in the hearts willing to be shaped by compassion more than certainty. As evening returned to Rome, the young priest who had sat beside Francis on his final night walked alone to the chapel where a single candle burned before an unadorned crucifix. He knelt not out of duty, but out of awe, for he realized he had witnessed more than the passing of a pontiff. He had witnessed the unveiling of Christ as forgotten, face the face that bends toward the least, the face that breaks through the illusions of power, the face that calls every soul to follow with courage. And he whispered a prayer shaped by the weight of everything that had unfolded. May we have the courage to look upon the face you reveal. May we have the strength to follow where that face leads. May your compassion become our courage. May your truth become our way. May your love become our life. Outside, the bells of Rome began to toll their sound, rising into the night, like a summons to a future not yet written. And the church, trembling yet hopeful, stood at the edge of dawn.